Reverb can make your mix awesome, or can make it totally cheesy and give you a sound tech solo. So today I'm going to teach you all about reverb, because when you get it right, it just feels so good. Reverb is one of the few sounds that we can actually add to the mix as an engineer. So when we're using it, we need to know that we're using it right, that we're making it feel good, and we're actually adding to the music. Now let's take a quick pit stop in Nerdville before we move on to Music Town. Reverb is trying to simulate and tell your brain that you're in a certain space using reflections. But how does your brain tell what kind of space you're in? Well, your brain uses timing and frequency differences of different sounds to tell you what kind of space you're in, how far away something is, how big the place is that you are, and even how close to a wall that you are. A digital reverb unit uses math to try to simulate what's happening in these spaces with all the different reflections and their timing and their tone to give you an idea that you're in a different space. There are basically three types of sounds that we'll hear in a space. The first is the direct sound, or the sound that goes immediately from the sound source to the listener. The second is the early reflections, or the bounces that hit off the wall and the ceiling before they arrive at the listener. After those bounces bounce around a bunch of different times, your brain melds those into one thing called reverberation. Now you've got to remember these because we're going to talk about them later when we're talking about creating space. Now that you understand the basic building blocks of what reverberation is happening in a real space, how do we translate that into controls that are on our digital reverb unit? The first parameter that you're likely to see is the reverb time, or RT60. What this does is controls the time, or how long it takes for the signal to come in from the original signal and dropping 60 decibels, or basically inaudible. The higher the number, the longer the reverb time. This is usually measured in seconds, and for some very short reverbs, it can be in milliseconds as well. The next parameter you're likely to see is the wet-dry mix, or how much of the affected signal is being mixed in with the dry signal, or what's being sent to the reverb unit. Now, the way that I always set this up in live sound is to keep it 100% wet, because I set up my effects on an aux send and an aux return. This way, I can send a bunch of different inputs to that same reverb unit. I don't have to have 12 different reverb units for 12 different instruments. I'll talk about the different types of spaces in just a second, but there's also another parameter on here called pre-delay. The pre-delay gives you another type of depth control. If you're in a very, very large room, those sounds have to travel all the way to the walls and back before the early reflections and reverb arrive at your ear. So the pre-delay control pushes back in time when the reverb starts, compared to when the original dry signal came into the unit. Another parameter you might see is the balance between the early reflections and the reverb. This lets you emphasize either the initial reflections that come back or the longer tail of the reverb. Finally, we're at the reverb type, or the type of space that we're trying to emulate. Some of the real spaces that they're emulating are cathedrals or churches, halls, reverb chambers, or even a small room. And thank you, PreSonus, you included a van on there. Seriously, PreSonus, who uses the van parameter? There are also some artificial reverb types, like plates and springs. A plate is actually a large metal plate that has contact drivers on it and piezoelectric pickups on it. So as the signal vibrates that plate, the piezoelectric pickups catch the resonance and translate that back into a reverb. If you think about it, it's kind of weird, but a long time ago it was a big space saver and it's pretty musical. Spring reverbs are popular on electric guitar amps, and they actually use suspended springs and the same kind of idea with a contact driver and another pickup on the other end. When you're choosing between these types of spaces, you're going to get a different texture from the different reflection times and how dense they are or how far apart they are. So we're pretty much done with Nerdville, but in order to get from Nerdville to Music Town, we've got to do a little bit more math. Music is happening over time, right? We have beats, we have measures, and we have tempo. Now with our reverb unit, we can take the tempo of a song that's in beats per minute, and we can translate that and pick a number of seconds and milliseconds that match the rhythms of the music. So a whole note has 4 beats in it. And if we're at 60 beats per minute, that becomes 1 beat per second. 4 of those beats becomes a 4-second reverb time for a whole note, or 4 beats at 60 beats per minute. A lot of times when I'm mixing music, I like my reverb times to be at a half note or a whole note. So to get the whole note measurement, you take 240 and divide that by the tempo of the song. If you want a half note, you take 120 and divide that by the tempo of the song. If you're trying to figure out what is the tempo, there are apps that you can download where you can tap in the tempo. It's kind of easy. So if you can tap in the tempo and then divide 240 by the tempo, you've got your whole note. It's pretty simple. This provides a good starting place. Now, if you want to go to Super Nerd Sound Ninja Master level, you can set your pre-delay to the tempo of the song as well. If you want to go for an 8th note, you take 30 and divide that by the tempo of the song. And if you want a 16th note, take 15 and divide that by the tempo of the song. You can even go for a 32nd note if you want. And this can feel really cool on the backbeat of a snare. It's almost like the reverb becomes a timed echo to the snare hit, and it can be a lot of fun. I might be getting a little too nerdy, aren't I? If you're loving this, go ahead and mash that thumbs up, but if it's getting a little too nerdy, you can hit the thumbs down and I'll be okay with that. So a minute ago, we talked about leaving the wet dry all the way wet. Now the way that we set up our reverb on a live console is I want to put it on a post-fader aux send. This way I can preserve the balance of the dry and wet signal when I'm riding my channel fader up and down. I'm not going to get more or less reverb based on how much I have my fader up. Another thing that helps you get your reverb level dialed in just right is to have it so that your return can live around 0 on your fader. That way you can get the most fine-tuning adjustments as you're riding it up and down. Right around 0, 1 millimeter might be half a decibel. But if you've got it pulled down at -20, a millimeter might be 2 or 3 decibels. The way I take care of this is I put my aux master send at -12. Often, -12 is a good starting place for a reverb level, but in live sound, we're also mixing our reverb from the console into the reverb of the room that's already there. So we might need even less there, or if you're in a very dry acoustic space, you might need a little bit more. Now, while we're talking about matching it to the room, you can EQ your reverb send to try to filter out some things that you don't want exciting the reverb module, and that helps get the reverb its own little space and not muddy up something else. A lot of times I'll put a high pass filter on, anywhere from 200 to 400 hertz, and a lot of times I'll make it darker by pulling the low pass filter down. I don't want a bunch of S's and T's jumping through and being distracting in the reverb. It doesn't really feel good. Also, the less high frequencies you have, it makes things feel further away, giving people a sense of depth that wasn't there before. Now, one more thing that can be really fun for your reverb return is to compress the reverb return. This gives an impression of a longer reverb because the tail comes back up as the compressor recovers. Compressing your reverb return can make your reverb feel either louder or longer without stepping on top of the dry signal. This in particular can add some sustain, especially to things like vocals. If there's a song that's a ballad or it's got a lot of long drawn out notes, You can support the vocal by riding up the reverb a little bit more on those long notes, and it just gives this nice, airy, spacious feeling and covers up maybe some of the "I'm running out of breath" sound that your singers might have. Another way to process your reverb on the return is to put a gate on it. This was really popular in the 80s, but 80s sounds are back in style now. So on a snare reverb, you could have it chop off, and you can even time that gate's release time or recovery time to the tempo of the song. So you're adding an extra right there, but then it stops. The final tip that I'll leave you is an advanced concept, but it can be a whole lot of fun and it can give a lot of realism to your reverb. The reverb masters really nail the early reflections part of their reverb unit. But sometimes the unit doesn't give you exactly what you want. So sometimes I like to mix in a short delay, under 100 milliseconds, into the reverb as well. And that just gives me control over what the early reflections might sound like. I'll usually use a stereo reverb, but I don't match the left and the right times to be integer multiples of each other. Whoa, sorry, a little too nerdy. I make it so that one isn't multiplied by 2 to get the other one. Maybe I care more than I should about that, but it helps it not feel just like a really quick ping pong delay. So on the left side of a delay, pick 25 milliseconds, and on the right side, pick 60 milliseconds. Experiment with what feels good, and then you can even route that delay return back into your reverb unit itself. It just adds this extra bit of space and dimension, and it can be something fun to try. Now, a few parting notes about reverb. You don't want to overdo it and make a sound tech solo. So when you're riding up your reverb returns, push it up so that you can hear it. Make sure that it's adding the texture or the feeling that you want and that nothing's bugging you about it. Then pull it back so that you can't hear it, right? And then find a spot in between there where when you mute it, it goes away and you're like, oh, something's missing. When you unmute it, you're like, this just feels right. I use the phrase, it's more conspicuous in its absence than in its presence. And that's how you can kind of get it dialed in to be just right, where you're adding the space that you want, but you're not calling attention to yourself.
You are our heart's desire. Come as a healer. Shout your name over us. You are the mighty redeemer. You are the one we want. Come in your power. Shout your name over us. You are the heart of the Father. You are our heart's desire. Come as a healer. Shout your name over us. You are the mighty redeemer. You are the one we want. Come in your power. Shout your name over us. You are.
To get enough time to play around with the reverb, you've got to get everything else set up well first. I mean, you're not going to play around with reverb while the bass guitar still doesn't work. So to help you out, I made a free guide for you. It's a sound check checklist. You can find it through the link in the description below. Don't forget to hit subscribe and hit the bell so that you can get notified every time I post a new video. And hey, if you're thankful for this channel and the videos I put out, you can say thank you by grabbing an Attaway Audio t-shirt. You can find them through the link in the description below. Don't forget that it's all about the low end, avoid the sound tech solo, and nobody leaves church humming the kick drum. We'll see you back here next time on Attaway Audio.